John Kasich welcomes Dreamers, and Central Ohio dreams of an Amazon headquarters. Joining us on Columbus on the Record this week, Andy Chow, State House reporter for Ohio Public Radio. Julie Carr-Smythe, State House correspondent for the Associated Press. Sam Gresham of Common Cause Ohio. And Michael Miller, attorney and former Franklin County prosecutor. Compared to other states, Ohio has relatively few so-called dreamers. They are the immigrants brought to the U.S. as children by their undocumented parents. They are subject to deportation in the next year or two because of the Trump administration's decision to end DACA, a program that allowed them to stay in the United States. While Congressman Pat Tiberi and Steve Stivers applaud the decision, Governor Kasich does not.
I mean, think about this. This is the United States of America, and we're putting kids, young people who are contributors in jeopardy. This is not the America that we all love. This is a melting pot. And by the way, if the Dreamers want to go somewhere and live, come to Ohio. We want all the immigrants to come to Ohio because we know how much they contribute to America.
Julie Carr-Smythe, he sounds like a Democrat there. The passion behind that interview was just incredible.
Yeah, it really was. I think partly I was wondering how many cups of coffee he had that day. But the point he makes next is sort of that he came as an immigrant. His grandparents came as immigrants, and that many people in this country came that way, that's a part of the American dream. And I think he's more connected maybe to his immigrant roots than to his party label, which wouldn't be too surprising.
He joked he would have been the president of Croatia if his parents hadn't come here. Andy, but he also said that Congress needs to get their act together and make Obama's order law, which is what President Trump is saying.
And I think the interesting thing here, too, is that he's been outspoken on health care. He's been willing to break against his party on health care. This is, yet again, him symbolizing, I'm ready to break against my party on a lot of things, on a lot of issues, not just health care, but on immigration and on other things that come up. So I think politically it's interesting to see how he's ready to take this bipartisan, middle-of-the-road rhetoric to the next level.
How does that play with Republicans that you talk to, Mike? They sympathize with him? Are they say he's nuts? I wouldn't vote for him again?
Well, I think it's probably in between, Mike. I think a lot of people look at this, what Trump is saying, I think he's saying anyway, is, what Obama did is against the Constitution. It's not proper. I think the Department of Justice has looked at it and says it is and it clashes with some immigration laws. Trump says, let Congress fix it. It's fine. Fix it or we got it. That's all we have to do. And Kasich is in favor of that too. But I'm a little hesitant when we have states, it's not Ohio, it's anybody, almost establishing independent governorships. Like, this is going to be a sanctuary-free thing. We're not going to pay attention to this, we're not going to pay attention to that. I really think that we ought to give the Congress an opportunity to do something. If they don't do it, maybe this is the last resort for people who are in favor of it.
This is the last thing that this Congress wanted to be wrestling with at this time.
Well, that's too bad, Sam.
It's an immigration law.
Yeah.
I think there's a sense of irony, and I also think this is one of those silver baubles that the president is making us run after. Now, think about this. He was being threatened by a group of attorney generals, correct? They gave him an artificial deadline in which he needed to do something. He didn't have to accept that deadline. He could have waited for them to sue him, and it would have been another year now before anybody would have to deal with this issue. So I think it's one of those baubles. He wants us to go in another direction, and he's not really wants to deal with the problem.
Well, and I will say that it seemed as if the statements by the president were somewhat in conflict. There was a point at which he was saying, do it or else, but then there was another interpretation of what he had said, which was basically, or it will be revisited, in which case it could be that he's more lenient than he was initially this past week.
Andy, we heard a lot before 2016 that Republicans had to soften their position on immigration because of the changing demographics. That didn't happen, went the opposite direction. But now we hear predictions that this will come back to hurt Republicans because of the changing demographics. Will it?
Well, I think what's going to be interesting to watch this issue grow, because this is yet again another issue where I think a lot of people think that they have a firm stance on it, but once they learn more about the topic, they begin to realize who their neighbors are and who this can actually impact. They might start to soften their position, just like healthcare. We saw that more and more people started to like the Affordable Care Act once they started realizing that, oh, I'm on it, or my friend's on it, or my neighbor's on it. So I think this is another issue where when more light is shined on it, maybe more people soften up to it.
Are you saying knowledge is a dangerous thing?
I'm saying more knowledge might come out of this.
Mike, you're an attorney, former prosecutor. Children are often the victims of their parents' mistakes or actions. What makes this different than, say, someone who's a child of someone who goes to prison for robbing a bank, for instance, or something like that?
Well, I don't know what makes it different, Mike. I mean, obviously these children haven't done anything, but you just get emotions take over when children are involved. What was it a couple of years ago when we had the child from Cuba?
Yeah,
and
Elian Gonzalez.
And I mean, that's right, just one small child, I forget what he was, 7 or 8 or something.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was all across the country, and people digging in one side or the other. This child had done nothing.
Yeah.
He just happened to be the focal point, and it's just emotions get involved. That's the same thing with this issue. These children obviously haven't done anything, yet we've had rules of immigration forever and ever and ever, and to just say, all right, since they're children, let's throw them out. A lot of people say that's not right.
But Mike, there's a dynamic that we have to focus on. The perceived color of these people. They're considered to be primarily Mexican. But if you look at the numbers and pull all the dirt back, the greatest number of people that we have are people who violate their visas. And they stay in this country longer than they. Guess where they're from? They're from the Philippines. They're from Europe. They're not Mexicans. But nobody focuses on them. And the only reason you focus on them is because it's perceived that it's Mexicans.
Many of the dreamers, though, are from Hispanic countries, either Mexico or Latin America.
And I do think that sometimes children get used on both sides of a political issue. I mean, I think we saw a couple of years ago with our marijuana issue that children were brought out as sort of a main reason why we should legalize medical marijuana. Even though really, if you looked at the numbers, that may not have been the largest group of people who would be affected by that, but they are a very sympathetic way of talking about an issue. In this case, some of these people are now grown, but they came in this way, and now they're working and sometimes, oftentimes paying taxes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Elian Gonzalez, I think, is close to 30 now. It's really kind of
Been that long?
Yeah, it's just bizarre. I mean, time goes on, I guess. In ordinary times, it would be redundant. A group of congressmen who say they are dedicated to governing. Imagine that. Well, these are not ordinary times, so Congressman Pat Tiberi has helped form a group of Republican congressmen dedicated to governing and getting things done. It's called the Republican Main Street Caucus. Its goal, build consensus among House Republicans to try to find pragmatic solutions to major problems. The new Main Street Caucus likely counters the Freedom Caucus, the far-right group led by Congressman Jim Jordan, also of Ohio. Like Miller, aside from the fact that who picks these names of caucuses, what does it say we have to have a caucus that says we're going to govern?
Well, I guess it doesn't say that anywhere, Mike, but we certainly need something to get this ball moving. Nothing's happened in the last 7.5 months, whatever. I think the key thing is Main Street is a nice phrase, which was taken from a previous committee, I guess, but I think the key thing is pragmatic. Mm-hmm. And I think they believe that the Freedom Caucus, if you will, the ultra-conservative group, is stymieing any sort of legislation, and they want to try and overcome that and open up, make it a bigger group, and I think that's the sole goal. And when they say pragmatic, practical, and so forth, they want the government to move and get something done, and they feel this is the best way to do it.
It almost feels like people are going out on a limb just to say that they want to be in this caucus, to break ranks with the Freedom Caucus, and to say that they want to find pragmatic approaches.
And to be in opposition. One of the things that I discovered when I started looking at the numbers, majority of people who are in the House have been elected since 2010. And those people have never known bipartisan rule. How do you ask an animal that came to Congress with the idea of never being bipartisan, and then you're going to ask them to be bipartisan? No, we're at a point where there needs to be a major cultural shift and to achieve your goal, Mike. And I think the only thing that's going to do that is an international crisis that brings everything to bear in this country. And maybe then we will get bipartisanship.
Julie, does this group give moderate Republicans cover? I mean, there's strength in numbers, so if you can get 70, 80 Republican congressmen to say, okay, I'm with this group, I'm trying to get stuff done, it gives you some cover.
Yes, I think it's a good idea for them to try to solidify sort of and signal to the president as well what type of a voting bloc he can count on. But at the same time, it seems to have the effect of formalizing the division between the factions of the Republican Party into two very distinct groups. So I don't know if all the Congress people will try to pick or choose one or the other, but it's certainly to say Main Street, is a good way to talk about kitchen table issues that average people maybe would care about.
I'm sorry.
Mike, is it good to get this out in the open? The Main Street Caucus against the Freedom Caucus, and they battle it out, and whoever wins, and that settles it?
Well, I don't know if it's going to be a combat type thing, Mike, winner takes all. But yes, I think it's good to have it out in the open. Yeah. Let people see that at least there's a group of people, a rather large group of people within the Republican Party that are really trying to get things done. And I like to think that there's an equal amount of large group in the Democrat Party that would like to get things done. I would love to see them start something like, a Main Street Democrat thing, and maybe the two of them get together and get some legislation passed.
So what are the chances of that? I mean, what if you were to get like a Pat Tiberi and then a moderate Democrat?
Slim and none right now. But now I have to pass out some kudos. Tiberi is a smart young man. He figured out, he toyed with the idea of being the Speaker of the House. Then there were a couple of chairmanships he wanted and he didn't get it. So he figured out there's another way that I can leverage my relationships and my power. I have to give him kudos for doing this.
He'll love the fact that you called him young, too.
Well, you have this governing caucus and the Freedom Caucus split. And so in the long run, if you're ever going to need to get anything done and you have these two sides, aren't you going to need Democrats to buy in, and won't this Main Street Caucus, they're going to have to reach out to Democrats at some point.
But let me tell you the one thing that bothers me is the label. And the label has a connotation and a perception. The Freedom Caucus is always to the right, and they seem to get stuck in that because they have that label on them, that they have to stay there. I'm not sure. In South Africa, they used to call it balkanization, how you separated the groups by that tribal component. Is that what we want?
Right, and I'm curious to see how this will function, as Andy says, because there are many caucuses within the Congress. There are caucuses for Italian Americans and caucuses for women and caucuses of Ohio and, et cetera, or Midwest states. So I think that the idea is, will it be, again, signaling to the president sort of some kind of a working relationship, or will it be beginning just to build that actual coalition?
Well, now that the president has gotten together with Schumer and Pelosi, he doesn't have to worry about the Republicans anymore, does he?
I don't know. That's the bipartisanship for you right there. The Labor Day rallies came and went. The high-profile Democrats, Richard Cordray and Jerry Springer, had their say and left without saying if they plan to run for governor. Cordray spoke at the Cincinnati AFL-CIO Labor Day picnic, but instead of passionate political rhetoric, he followed the law and spoke only about his job as head of the Financial Consumer Protection Bureau. Jerry Springer attended a union rally in Cleveland. He was a little more fired up, but said only he'll decide on a run in the next month or so. Andy, you were in Cincinnati.
I was in Cincinnati for Cordray.
How did it go over? What was it like? It sounds kind of boring.
Well, it was definitely it was a tame speech. He went up there. He had a binder. He didn't say anything until he opened the binder and then read straight from it. And I think it's because I know that what I've written down here is within the law. I know that I'm not going to be doing anything wrong if I just read what I have right here. And so it was this measured speech that we're used to hearing from Cordray anyway. Not a lot of people were there to see him speak, but there wasn't a lot of promotion for it anyway on the Coney Island grounds. What I think the most interesting thing of the day was his ability to actually go around, mingle, and talk to people, and meet and greet union workers, meet and greet the leaders that he wants to talk to. So I think that day, aside from his public appearance, may have been played a big role in him testing the waters when he was meeting and greeting people.
Could you argue that's politics?
It's called retail politics.
Well, he's not supposed to do politics.
That hatch hangs out there, doesn't it?
That's the federal law that prohibits employees from
keeps
being
people
political.
from doing that.
Yeah.
I personally like Rich. I think he's very smart. If you remember, he won a television show called Jeopardy or something. He was the big winner, so he's very smart. So I didn't think he would come out and do a passionate speech.
Right.
I thought he would stay within the law. But again, I say, he's not a gubernatorial candidate. He is a senatorial candidate. And I think he would be better at that, particularly with what he's doing now.
He's in the federal government.
Right.
Right.
Jerry Springer, we're going to know in a month or so.
I think.
What's the betting line there?
I guess what struck me the most about the weekend was more the idea that we have these 4 Democrats already in the race, 3 of whom are female. This is the year after Hillary Clinton sort of energizes, and after her defeat, we saw the Women's March and all these things, and I just think it was interesting that they are getting all the buzz and continue to. Granted, the 4 who are in, they don't have the kind of name ID. They haven't won the statewide race a couple of times like Rich Cordray has, and none of them would have the high-profile name of a Jerry Springer, another TV personality.
Who do Republicans want to run against? Jerry Springer, Richard Cordray, Betty Sutton?
Well, I can't speak for all the Republicans, but I suppose if it were me, I think I would. I know Andy would disagree, but I think I'd take Springer. But I don't think Springer's going to be a candidate, and I disagree somewhat with Sam because if Rich wants to be a senator, and I know Rich too, and I like him, if he wants to run, he's not going to run next year, obviously, that's out. Portman was just elected. I don't think he can sit 5 years, basically, before he starts to run again. That's a long, long time. And I'm not saying he is going to run for governor, but I certainly would not be shocked if he said, I'm in.
I think if you look at Cordray and Springer, they present different challenges to different Republican candidates. So
Sure.
I think it'd be interesting to see somebody like John Husted go up against Jerry Springer because those are 2 very different personalities. Then again, if you had Cordray going up against a DeWine or a Renacci, so I think each person, it would make a different dynamic.
I think that's a very interesting observation. But I'm going to tell you, President Trump, everybody laughed at him. Don't laugh at Jerry Springer. Don't do that. The one thing I've learned is name ID is very important.
Celebrity.
Yes.
All right. Get ready for a bidding war like no other. Amazon wants to build a second headquarters somewhere in North America. They really narrowed it down. And Central Ohio is expected to make a big push for it. The online retail company says it plans to spend $5 billion on a second headquarters. It would employ as many as 50,000 people, many making 6-figure salaries. Central Ohio would seem to be well positioned. Amazon recently has built 3 data centers and 2 distribution centers in the area. But to land it, cities and states are going to have to provide possibly billions in dollars in incentives. Julie Carr-Smythe, looking at my Twitter feed today, every city wants Amazon.
Every city.
What are the chances of Ohio or Columbus getting it?
Well, it's interesting. We just also, in addition to the Amazon developments that you mentioned, we have just recently gotten a Facebook data center, and they mentioned that a lot is happening in Ohio that attracted them here, including the availability of clean energy. Obviously, there's land here, and incentives. Although the governor has been interesting in the signals he's sending, because he had said he's also trying to get Foxconn to come here, and he has said, I don't want to buy these deals. I want them to come for the right reasons, and I'm not going to get in this kind of a bidding war. I guess we'll see.
There will be a bidding war for Amazon,
Oh, yeah, there'll be a
like
bit.
there was for Boeing or.
But Judy raises a question. How long can we keep being corrupt and giving them money under the table and giving them tax breaks, and that makes them come to our community? Central Ohio has one great attribute in those states that run vertically and horizontally. They are close to us. 60% of the population of the United States is in with 60-minute ride on an airplane. That is a strategic value. Also, 71 and 70 make a big difference. Now, if we could get our rail together in Central Ohio and in those 3-state regions, we become much more competitive. Now, the final component is having educated people, a constant pipeline of bringing out well-trained people. And I think we're getting there, but we're not quite there yet for that.
The deals that they can offer Amazon, that can be done in a matter of months or even a year, Mike. But the long-term things that Sam was talking about, these things have been debated, they've been evolving over decades. So that's really what's going to bring a company here. It's the workforce, it's the infrastructure, it's the ability to get and attract talent. Has Ohio done enough in that area?
Well, to me, Columbus is just such a vibrant city that has done so well the last 2 decades or so, really exploded, I think, and just been fantastic. With the Ohio State University here with Battelle, with Capital, I think you've got people coming out who are highly educated. It would be something that would fit right into what Amazon wants. Plus, we've got some Amazon people in the area here now anyway, businesses and so forth. And I think Columbus stands a very decent chance, certainly in the game. And when you talk about 50,000 jobs they talk about, of paying about $100,000 each, goodness gracious, that kind of money in any economy would just be unbelievable.
Go ahead, Andy.
This brings up the same question that I always wonder when we talk about getting the Republican National Convention and all those other things. Do we have the transportation for it? Do we have public transportation that would be enough for 50,000 people? Are the highways efficient enough? And I think that's going to be a big question mark. You look at places like San Francisco that has a crazy amount of traffic because they also cater to these kinds of companies. I think it's going to be interesting to see how Columbus stacks up when it comes to transportation.
I was in Cincinnati 2 weeks ago, and I'm walking down the street. I didn't know they had light rail. I was just blown away. Andy, you are absolutely right. Those types of amenities that move people at low cost and with efficiencies are the types of things that attract those types of corporations.
And they're young workers.
And they're young workers. Now, Columbus is, for young white people, it is like the second or third best place to be in the United States, I've been told and posed. So I think we have a lot of amenities. I still think the sticking thing is, do we have the workforce ready to do what they need to do?
All right, let's get to our final topic. The campus free speech debate continued this week. Last week it came out that OSU had banned those funny, sometimes politically provocative signs in dorm windows. This week OSU rejected a request by white nationalist Richard Spencer to speak on campus. OSU officials say it's a safety issue. They can't accommodate the request without a substantial risk to public safety. Sam Grisham, should he be allowed to speak on the Ohio State campus, a white nationalist?
This is where I'm split. I'm a member of Common Cause, so the First Amendment, the ability to speak, should be there. But I also understand what the white nationalists and the alt-right are doing. They're on a campaign now. They're on a campaign to recruit people to their membership. They're on a mission to put their ideology out on public display so they can hope they can get more people in. My Common Cause side says to me he should have the right to speak. We let the Ku Klux Klan come to Columbus, and they went to the state capitol, and we did everything to protect them. But on the second side, that's a lot of expense. Yeah. And does Ohio State and does the city of Columbus want to spend that expense? So I'm kind of split, all right?
Where is that line, Mike, where the president comes to Ohio State, and there's a lot of security goes into that and the big expense? They handle it. There'll be protesters. This is different.
Well, it is different, but I forget who said it, and I should know that about, I disagree with everything you say, but I'd fight to the death your right to say it. And that's how we kind of grew up and learned things like that. And I think everybody should have the opportunity. Now, I like Sam, I understand these people, there's just a small amount of them in the nation coming in and the expense. But what troubles me is that when they talk about violence, it's from the dissenters, the people that are coming. So they're the threat to violence, and so they win, and we say, okay, because you may create violence, the other side can't speak. That really, really troubles me in this country, that you have that. I understand the money. I don't want to hear them anyway, but just the very concept of it is very troubling to me.
I think as a journalist, I have to say, the First Amendment, and the ability to speak, and especially for young people at Ohio State to hear these ideas and get a chance to actually bounce those things off each other and talk about them and actually pull them apart in an educational environment, I think there's some value in that for sure.
Let's get to our off-the-record final parting shots. And Mike Miller, we'll start with you.
Well, we could talk about the Red Sox cheating and the Indians winning 15 in a row, important stuff. But I suppose all of us are thinking about that tragic hurricane that's about to hit the state of Florida, and we just hope that everybody's going to be able to survive it. Apparently, it's going to be the worst in the history that we know of civilization. The numbers add up.
All right. Sam.
Don't sleep the city council race. There's a young candidate out there named Jasmine Harris who's stirring up the population. We'll see. Just don't sleep it.
Columbus City Council.
It's Columbus City Council. Just don't sleep it, because she's doing a lot of things in the African American community that may make a difference.
Julie.
There's going to be an interesting case to watch this coming week. The Capital Care Toledo Abortion Clinic versus the Ohio Department of Health comes up in the Ohio Supreme Court. Both sides are looking at it as pretty pivotal in the constitutionality of that package of abortion restrictions that were passed in 2013.
And Andy.
So if Josh Mandel wins the Republican nomination, then it would be a rematch between him and Sherrod Brown. The University of Virginia Center of Politics looked at how many rematches there have been in the history of U.S. Senate races. Only 46 times, but there was one time in Ohio, Howard Metzenbaum versus Robert Taft Jr.
And he beat him.
He lost the first time, won the second time.
Which one's the lost?
Metzenbaum, yep.
That's right. All right. There are signs that we're going to be okay, and the signs of those long lines of volunteers down in Texas lining up to volunteer to help folks is a good sign that we're going to get through all this political discord and come together as a country. That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Check us out online, Facebook, Twitter, and our website, WOSU.org. For our crew and our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.